Given the fact that this was a major topic in my Cho'Gath video, you should have figured this video was coming as well. In League of Legends, champions are not allowed to be bad. This is not to say that there can't be bad champions in the sense of being weaker to others or simply being flawed in some way. I mean bad in a sense that Riot simply does not allow champions to remain as situational picks and punishes champions who are strong counter picks. Also, I am not going to make the absolute claim that this is overall terrible for a video game to have. You can decide whether or not you feel this is a problem with the game or not, but I am bringing this up because it is a constant balance issue that crops up a lot. First off, I'm going to make it clear that the reasoning for this is totally not unjust or illogical. Riot sells the champions. You do not have every champion readily available to you. People have to spend their time and or their money to obtain these champions. It would be very harsh if the champions you obtained were only usable in certain situations and trash in all others. With that said, it's created a gray blob of homogeny. Champions in League are very similar to each other in power levels with very few outliers and only separated in structure based on roles. Most tanks have similar qualities as other tanks with only a few differences, sometimes not big enough to really consider one over the other unless numbers make the final sway, and most can be picked in nearly all team compositions. There are some champions that are very powerful pushers, but not so much so that other champions can't comparably do the same job in some way. Now again, this is not to say that there aren't champions that are clearly better than others in certain aspects. What I'm implying is that champions in League are comparable in power in a curve. A gentle curve in a power level chart would signify that the champions below the top one in that aspect are not that far off from each other. You can say that Sivir is one of the best, if not the best, marksman pusher, but below her is Tristana, whose power level isn't significantly below Sivir's, so you could pick Tristana and you can consider whoever is a step down from Tristana and so forth. What I mean is that overall your pushing power as you go down the curve would not diminish that much until you hit the very bottom. But why is this a problem? It's problematic because it makes whoever is at the top of any one given aspect have less justification to be picked if they aren't as strong overall as someone below the curve, even in a situation which would have been benefiting them in the first place. Why pick X champion for their amazing pushing if Y champion is a better champion right now overall and isn't that far off from X in terms of pushing? A few seasons ago, we had a singular tank meta in which Trundle would have excelled and crushed. Sadly, even though this meta would have been amazing for him, he simply wasn't picked. I was asked by fans constantly about it since I was always lauding how great Trundle is at countering these champions, and the only answer was because even though Trundle is great at countering them, it is better to just pick whoever is an S tier champion than a counter. This then severely affects the one-note champions and older champions who were designed around countering others. There are some champions in League that are constantly in and out of metas depending on whether or not they fit or counter it. Cho'Gath is a good example as I recently talked about him in length, but we have Malphite and Rammus who are also contenders for this. Now these champions are far from perfect. They have exploitable weaknesses, some major flaws, and bad matchups. However, they absolutely destroy certain types of champions to the point where they can sometimes make them irrelevant. These counter champions and any others I did not mention then go through changes because they oppress the meta in some way. However, once the meta shifts, they are left weaker than they were before. I feel that if the meta were to naturally shift away, then the problem with these champions would have left with them as well. These champions would suffer in other metas, which is why they usually weren't picked prior to an advantageous meta occurring. Cho'Gath's history is a perfect example of this. Whenever the meta shifts into one that relies heavily on combo champions, he shows up and wrecks them. Back in Season 2, Jungle Cho'Gath became a thing because he absolutely crapped on the mid lane combo champions like Katarina that were dominating. People rallied against Cho'Gath saying he was too strong and too oppressive and that he should be nerfed. However, eventually Katarina and the other combo users were phased out and Cho'Gath just disappeared. In a sense, it is not fun when you get absolutely hand-blasted by a counterpick and there is absolutely nothing you can do. This is why Riot has no qualms about nerfing meta-dependent champions when they're being used and then buffing them back up when they fall out of style. However, it just creates an unhealthy and annoying pattern where any outliers are punished simply for being too perfect for a situation. Now, I know some of you hate when I bring up Dota, but Dota has the opposite to the extreme, and it showcases both how amazingly awesome, but also frustratingly unfun it can be. There are some heroes in Dota that absolutely, without remorse, shit on other heroes. There's a hero called Pugna that absolutely destroys champions with spammable abilities, so much so that he can auto-win against them. He severely punishes enemy heroes with spammable abilities and high cost abilities since his ward punishes them for it. It nukes them based on the cost of the mana they spent. There is another hero called Skywrath Mage that spams abilities and it has a high mana cost, and if he cast his ultimate near Pugna's ward, then he might have just killed himself. If you were Skywrath, that game would simply be unfun 100% and you'd be pissed and upset. If you were Pugna, you'd be giddy as hell because your counterpick was beautiful and you were being rewarded for it. Riot's pattern in avoiding this negates both scenarios nearly completely. There are few absolute counters in the game, so you don't ever feel like you lost before the game even started, but at the same time your creative champion choices are rarely rewarded. Again, you can decide whether or not you prefer it this way or the other way. I am simply bringing this up for discussion. Now, on a different note, this creates an interesting situation for solo queue and competitive. In solo queue, it makes it so you can freely pick most of the champions that you want to play without absolutely screwing yourself over. I can admit there's a lot more freedom of choice in League, while in Dota, I am honestly afraid of picking who I want early because I know someone might just shit on me. However, it is the exact opposite in competitive. The LCS teams are basically forced to only pick the top tier champions constantly and not make any potentially unsafe picks. This is why we see the same champions picked over and over. There is no reason to reach out of the top tier champion pool and make a creative pick if it's not going to make enough of a positive difference in their chances to win. To reiterate the entire thing, while there are some champions that are clearly worse than everyone else, in general, Riot will not allow champions to be too weak or too strong in certain areas and instead will try to keep them at least leveled with similar role champions. Even if some champions are still better than others in some areas, it isn't by an extreme margin, and as such these champions can be replaced by a lesser champion who covers more ground. This too makes it so counterpick champions aren't really a thing in League, and those counterpick champions that still exist constantly undergo changes even when they likely would have been phased out when the meta shifts. On one hand, this prevents players from getting absolutely wrecked in counterpicks, but on the other hand, it means you get less rewarded for making creative picks. You can decide whether or not you prefer it one way or another, but as it stands, it's something that the League Balance team constantly has to deal with. Either way, I welcome all thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Thank you for watching. Videos like this are made possible by my sponsors, Crunchyroll and Loot Crate. Loot Crate's upcoming April crate contains Harry Potter, Vikings, Labyrinth of the David Bowie kind, and Uncharted stuff. If you're interested in any of those themes and would like to check out the offer, click the link in the description below. Using either service greatly supports my channel and I'll appreciate it tremendously.